A very interesting conversation about what it takes to be literate enough to hold a good conversation took place in Twitter over about the last week and a half, and I'd like to give you some of the interesting comments, retweets, and other things that people have said. So let's begin at the beginning. We have this guy who calls himself Coeur de Lion, meaning Lionheart, who goes by Sufi Pervert, and he issued a shot across the bows saying that the bare minimum for holding a conversation, and then listed a bunch of authors: Dante, Goethe, Homer, Tolstoy, Aristotle, Pushkin, Blake, Lermontov, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Cellini, Thucydides, Tacitus, Montaigne, Virgil, Shakespeare, Stendhal, Cellini, Machiavelli, Melville, Milton, Conrad, Rimbaud, and Hölderlin. And then he followed it up by saying, this is supposed to be a basic list. If interested, I would also recommend some of my personal favorite authors: Xenophon, Lawrence, both T-E and D-H, good clarification there, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Van Gogh's Letters, Rilke, Plutarch, Rabelais, Boccaccio, and Juvenal. Now that's a rather eclectic list of people. Doesn't list any of their works, of course, and we're going to see that quite a few people had interesting responses to this of different sorts. So the two that I actually liked the best, I wanted to front load at this time. Christina posted, "Is there something I should read that will prevent me from making posts like this?" What a great one-liner. And then Daniel's is even better. Damn, I've never talked to any of those guys. So playing what we call the straight man in comedy, the person who kind of doesn't get it, but man, does that skewer it. Now, to be sure, if you go to this person's Twitter account, you are going to find that it's not all about great literature. He has a lot of other things going on, so I just wanted to put some of this out there in front right away. James Edwards says, yeah, I'm sure you're everybody's favorite conversationalist, a real social and intellectual delight. And he reposts Coeur de Lion saying, when you truly philosophize and dwell on the concepts of God's infinite and boundless love for each and every person at any given moment, you will begin to understand a fraction of the love Hitler had for the German people. And Zimbo says, this guy has said even dumber things. Another person says, aside from being an insufferable prick who has definitely never actually read any of these authors, he's also literally a Nazi, probably a rapist, and given the date he account, likely a Fed. Then there were a few other things posted by him that came up. Svengali points out a tweet that says, I will not get a job. I will not improve my work ethic. I will not find a girlfriend. I will not form productive habits. I will play video games. I will read books all day. I will have a devil-may-care attitude towards the future. I will not compromise. I mean, isn't that nice to be sticking to your principles like that? And then finally, Amanda says, I clicked on this bozo's profile and the first things I see are Bronze Age pervert retweet, land sharks rides coal, self-filleting sensitive young man garbage, ice cape shit. Can somebody make a bingo card for these pod people? And the reference there, in case you're missing it, is to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where these aliens replace real people with fake people. And yeah, there's a lot of fake people out there on Twitter like this. Now, you might say, well, that's not very nice to point out all of these other things in the person's background, but it's fair game. I mean, you're on Twitter. Let's see some others that some other people might have a problem with, saying, oh, this is really just a flaw or a misstep. So he did mention Cellini twice, and Zinnian says, that's why no one holds a conversation with you. Also, isn't it funny how you're coming across as some erudite intellectual and then slip up shamelessly by including Cellini twice? You just disheveled dipstick. And then two other people noted that as well. Cellini's so nice, you had to put him twice. And even better, I only like the second Cellini, so I'm out. So those are pretty good. And then now we're getting a little bit more serious about it. H.L. Mencken's Ghost says, having read most of these thinkers, this is pretentious nonsense. Not to mention that one of those exalted icebreakers is very clear on the fact that he, namely Schopenhauer, thought it was bad to read too much. He assumed you'd lose the ability to think for yourself. Here's the proof. And then he quotes the tweet. And somebody else writes, no, the bare minimum for holding a conversation beyond competency in a shared language is a shared interest in hearing and learning what others have to teach you, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But notice this. It strikes me as telling that Plato figures in neither the first list nor the second. The best conversationalist that we know of just doesn't matter, apparently. And that is indeed a glaring error. It's a little bit strange not to see that. You maybe suspect that it's because, Aristotle's good, but Plato's bad in certain authors' works that perhaps this Lionheart has read in the past, like Ayn Rand, for example. Here's some other good joking, but also kind of half-serious ones. So since he did mention Melville, Nate Wolf says, bare minimum for holding a conversation. The semicolon in the full title of Moby Dick. The dedication to Hawthorne in Moby Dick. Etymologies and extracts in Moby Dick. The setological interludes in Moby Dick. Captain Ahab's major soliloquies in Moby Dick. Stuff that reminds you of, and then it cuts off there. And, this is actually a great point here that he's making without spelling it out completely, namely that if you're going to bring up Melville, you're obviously thinking of Moby Dick, but probably some other things as well. And just bringing up a name doesn't mean that you actually know what's in the book. That book famous for its digressions. Then here's another great one from Francis Forbes Carbines. Have you read Thucydides, Homer, and Aristotle in the original Greek? If you haven't, then no conversation. And you see this all the time with people who are kind of, Western canon pseudo-intellectuals that they bring up, oh, you got to read this person and this person. And then, you talk with them and you're like, well, I don't think you've actually read them, and certainly you don't understand them. You're relying on some bad translation much of the time, or even glosses. So let's move on, because now we have an entirely different approach to this. And I'm going to give you the biggest one along these lines first. Some people could not resist the temptation to weigh in on this and to say, actually, in a nerdy sort of way, this is the canon that you need to be looking at. So I won't go through all of this, but Zertman is saying for cultural literacy, you should almost certainly add. And now it's kind of funny. Plato and Socrates. And Socrates is already there in the Xenophon and is there in Plato. And that's basically where we're getting Socrates from. So Zertman is already tripping up on the first thing that he's saying there. The Bible, not an author, but absolutely central. Why? Because terms like prodigal son, Job's comforters, Armageddon. Who have you ever heard talking about Job's comforters, right? Chaucer, Homer, but Hirsch, little name dropping there, would want Sophocles and Aeschylus, since Oedipus and Prometheus are universal reference points. Virgil you included, but Ovid is equally common. Cervantes, Voltaire, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, Dickens. Then he talks about Scrooge, Oliver Twist, Bleak House are shorthand in conversation. Well, Scrooge certainly is. Oliver Twist, Bleak House, I don't know. I don't know too many people who talk about that. Robert Frost and Walt Whitman, and then Poe, right? And he says, if a child or adult cannot place these names, they will often miss the point of an editorial, essay, or even a casual conversation. Yeah, I don't know about casual conversation. Or, even editorials or essays. I guess it depends on where you're reading them. Maybe in the New Yorker or the Atlantic, but I don't know about my local paper being like that. we can find a whole bunch of other great suggestions, and I'm not going to go through all of these. You can look at them yourself. Other people are saying, and perhaps it's being ironic, or perhaps they are really committed to it. They bring up a whole bunch of other authors saying these are the ones that you really should be focusing on. And these are all great authors, but I don't know that we need to have this sort of, what would you call it, academic bona fides being presented, or cultural jockeying and measuring of things against each other. And then we get some other ones that are a little bit shorter. No Spengler? How plebeian. And that's kind of funny because, if you've ever read Spengler, well, you don't want the masses being too involved in things. No Kaczynski, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Skipping or forgetting Wittgenstein, sissy. Bare minimum for holding a conversation, Peterson, Brown, and Chopra, right? So some guru types. And then somebody else was like, I would replace Stendhal and Holderlin with Henry James and Dickens. So it's not, this list that is really problematic. It's just that some of the entries are wrong. Add Boethius and We Good. And then you forgot Lord of the Rings. Well, you really forgot Tolkien, because what the person was talking about was authors, not particular works. And then this is one I actually think is quite telling. I'm sorry, but the fact you left out Dostoevsky is unacceptable. We move on now to a different part of the conversation, which has to do with thinking about what true conversation or good conversation actually involves. And so there's a few good one-liners here by several people, an admirable list, though one might argue that true conversation transcends mere name dropping, saying that you're not even holding a real conversation here on Twitter with interlocutors. Good reading list, but holding a good conversation is more than making increasingly obscure literary references. That's very true. And then here's another important aspect of conversations. Ever thought of having a laugh with a pal? It's not always about showing off how smart you are in conversation or what books you've read. Going on, some people pointed out some very basic facts about having a conversation, especially bare minimums for having a conversation. So Howard says, you don't even need to be fluent in a language to hold a conversation. They literally call it conversational English when you're not fluent but can hold a conversation in English. This is gatekeeping a basic everyday activity for no reason. Jake says, this is just so bizarre. Bare minimum for holding a conversation is a basic grasp of a common language. This, meaning what Coeur de Lion put up, this is what might be required for a particularly demanding and pretentious grad school class. Then we rise to a slightly higher level of conversation with a number of other things that people are noting. The bare minimum for holding a conversation, sharing a common interest with the person you're talking to, or actually listening and feeling, not just waiting your turn to say the thing you want to state. I think we all know people like that. Make sure they want to talk, make it interesting. Above all, don't be a dick. Being able to relate to the person you're conversing with and not coming over as an insufferable elitist. Then Nathan White says, I've talked about all these, but never with my barber, and I consider those the best conversations I have, so I would revise the below qualifications to the following: be human, have a sincere interest in another human, and be able to communicate. And then finally, Nate says, and this is a bit more that's being asked for: curiosity, focus and attention, social grace, generosity, self-restraint, thoughtfulness, a sincere interest and coherent action toward the cultivation of a coherent worldview, patience and willingness to delay gratification, humor and wit. And those are all good things, but I don't think you have to have all of those to have a good conversation. Then we can go to yet a more expanded level. Amplios says, take a vow of silence then. The group you're referring to is an insanely small group of people. And Plato comes up again here. Plato made a point of speaking to commoners to further understand the world. I would say that's more Socrates. There are so many interesting people in various circumstances everywhere you look to close yourself off from seeing the world from as many sets of eyes as possible is to give yourself blindness to many realities. Lipstick Band-Aid says, I'd rather talk to people with real-world experience that have learned philosophical lessons through their life experiences than someone who walks around with their head up their arse because they read a bunch of books. I've learned crazy lessons from people with no access to books. Daniel says, complimentary thought, if one cannot find wisdom in uneducated people, perhaps it is one who lacks the bare minimum to hold a conversation, which reminds me of Augustine saying in one of his works that there are illiterate old ladies who know more about faith, hope, and charity than learned theologians and bishops, which is something that one could find if one actually read Augustine, right? Eric says, this is a fun tweet, but you can get so much enjoyment talking to literally anyone if you figure out what their passion is. Hermann Hesse and Augustine are great, but K-pop, cats, Disney, plumbing, and Hungarian politics can be sources of wisdom if you let them. Then Jeff Sullivan says, bare minimum for holding a conversation, life experience. All writings are math or commentaries on reality and lived experience, sometimes encoded in symbols. If you have no lived experience, you can't appreciate books beyond, ooh, pretty words. Now we veer off again into rather more derogatory, but perhaps very on point little statements that people had to make. And on this slide, I wanted to bring together those that talk about 3 P's: pompous, pretentious, and performative. So we start with Trouble saying, you could have just said I'm a pompous git, but I suppose you felt the need to go that extra mile to show it off. Nick Norris said you spelled pretentious stroke job wrong, meaning that's the substitute for the conversation. Ben says this is the most pathetically pretentious posts I've ever seen. Gabrielle says performative culture is the enemy of literature, so of life itself, saying that putting together a list like this is really performative. Wheeljack expands upon that, rattling off a bunch of names with no further explanation as to their significance to you is the hallmark sign of a shallow, insecure dilettante. Not only is nobody impressed by this kind of performative behavior, they are embarrassed by it. And then Leslie says, blimey, what sort of conversations do you have? I'm familiar with fewer than half of the names on that list, and I consider myself to be well read. I can certainly hold my own on most subjects with customers to the bookshop where I work. So somebody who works with books and literate people all day long. Then following this up, AIM Worldwide says, I'd rather converse with someone who has more thoughts of their own than what they can parrot from people they believe intelligent people parrot. If those are your passions, by all means, do your thing, but I have no need to partake. Open Oak says, we know this is a bullshit grifter account, but one of the more transparent forms of gatekeeping is one that simply puts a random set of parameters to keep you out. What you're looking at is shallow comprehension and a lack of experience. If you meet a person like this, move on. Professor Who says, only dumb people think there's a list of necessary authors required to hold a conversation, and this list looks like something an average male first-year philosophy student would say he likes to read in his spare time because he's an edgy intellectual. Finally, Thag says, hate to say it, but that's not a conversation. It's ego masturbation for faux intellectuals. And, the basic point here is if you actually did read these authors and you didn't just run your eyes over it or read some summaries, you really would have changed and you wouldn't be saying these sorts of things like, putting together lists of that sort. Following up with this, Art says it's rather sad to think of a person reading even half these writers and still hitting send on such a philosophically clumsy tweet. Chris says knowing the names of some intellectual writers does not in and of itself make you a better or even smarter person. If that's the lessons you are learning from these writers, they are the wrong ones. And then Blett says if your style of conversation involves directly quoting various great books and philosophers and expecting people to get the reference, well then sure. But if you're truly smart, you can summarize the ideas held in these books whenever they're relevant or quote correctly. Moving on, and now getting to a very personal level, but again, I think rather deserved in this case. Chris Notimus says, people must groan when you enter a room. Michael says, you must be an insufferable bore at any social event. Darth Monk says, I get the feeling you're not fun at all to speak with. And, that's probably on point, I would be willing to say, and decent feedback. Then we start getting into, let's call it geek stereotype or nerd stereotype or dork stereotype regions. No Quarter says, I just heard Milady and smelled flat red Mountain Dew while reading this post. That old guy over there, only if I'm talking to an autistic lit major. Cohen Tell says, some of these guys were cool, but I know you got stuffed in lockers in high school. Finally, Lib Chud says, LARPing is a misunderstood intellectual. Doesn't make you mysterious and interesting. It makes you weird and off-putting. And then to bring it to a close, here's the last ones that I wanted to mention. Samsara says, not once will probably 80% of these people just come up in a conversation, and it will only happen if you bring it up. This is the attitude of a book lover who doesn't use any of their knowledge or what they've learned. Just because you've read lots of literature doesn't mean anything if you don't do something with it. This seems like reading for the sake of reading, no real goal, which, by the way, I'm okay with reading for the sake of reading, but there is a good point there. Anonymous McReal name calls out a bunch of things. Aristotle, but no Plato. Thucydides, but no Herodotus. Nietzsche, but no Kant. Shakespeare, but no Chaucer. No Augustine, Descartes, or Camus. Now, those do come up in the other list, but not, Camus. I know what you are. JV says, amazing example of ahistorical psycho Twitter. I didn't know there was such a thing out there, but I guess maybe there is. There's already a literary canon. No one cares about your version. 99% of conversations about Thucydides take place on college campuses and at ancient history conferences. Lermontov has one novel. These words are not in reality. Not sure what the last thing means, but he's clearly calling this person out as a poser or pseud. Finally, Daniel says, the Western literary canon is indeed a major source of wisdom. Glad to see a fellow traveler on this path, which is probably being a little generous. Yet, there are many paths to wisdom. Your reliance on a canon betrays lack of experience. Your desire to push the canon onto others betrays lack of wisdom. And I like those sentiments. I think it's important always to place canons into a kind of perspective. So that is it for this roundup. If you have ideas sparked by this, go ahead and put them in the comments. And if you've got experiences with people like this, you can talk about that. Whatever it is that you find compelling or interesting or think you need to say about that, I would say probably we don't need any more additional canons or tweaks to his canon, but pretty much anything else should be fair game. We'll do more of these Twitter conversations. I just had to bring up this one because I found it so amusing and interesting, and maybe I'll do some writing about this down the line.